Good morning. I was wondering when you're going to get up. It's almost lunchtime. I hope you enjoyed your room. You like my office? From what I understand, it used to be the old conference room, but I like that there's two exits to it. I know it's a bit cramped here and all, but I guess that's what happens when you dig a basement out from underneath an old school building. Since APOC took over, the schools have largely been ignored. They even forgot to turn off the Wi-Fi or clean out the library in this place. I know it's not much, but it's home. It's a great base. We only come up during the day, though. Turning on the lights at nighttime is just asking for trouble. And there's a ton of natural light during the day, so it works out. Honestly, my favorite room is that one upstairs in the corner. Remember the one I showed you last night with all the windows? It's just beautiful there at dinner time. Anyway, speaking of dinner, you hungry? I hope so. I hope you like Bojangles. We have to meet a contact there. One of the cashiers is a kid I've been working for a little while. Her brother is a deputy in the mayor's office, and it turns out he's a bit sloppy. He brings his work home with him and just leaves it laying around. From what she tells me, her brother, let's call him Keith, brought a USB that was just laying there and was sitting on the kitchen counter for a couple days. She swiped it, and apparently he works in the historic memory department, so this could be pretty big. All right, let's go. I'll buy you a biscuit. Hi. Nina, right? Yeah. I'll have 2 chicken biscuits and 2 large coffees, milk and sugar. And that extra special item you have, you know what I mean? All right, this is good, really good. Of course, we'll get this back before your shift ends. All right, let's go to work. Grab that booth in the back over there and let's get started.
American colonists didn't see themselves as American. They saw themselves as British. They expected to be treated like British citizens. They wanted to have rule of law, which means even the king was expected to follow the same rules in society as everybody else. They also expected to have the rights of Englishmen, and there were a number of these expectations. The 2 most important were to have a right to a trial by their jury of peers and to have taxes levied only by their representatives. And at this point, we've already discussed that they did not have representation in Parliament. They only had representation in the colonial assemblies. Now, it's important to remember, where did these English rights come from? Well, the English didn't have a written constitution like we have today. They had a constitution made up of traditions. They had a number of important documents. First of all, the Magna Carta, which was written all the way back in the 1400s. And in that, it says that all free men had the right to be taxed only with representation, and they had a right to a trial by jury of peers. Later, after the Glorious Revolution, these rights were again reaffirmed. The Parliament gained more power after the English Bill of Rights, and there was some religious freedom expectations. There are others, but those are the big ones.
All right, let's see what we got here. Oh, wow. Wow, this looks great. Just what we were hoping for. That guy in the corner, his name is Powley. He was a teacher from a time before the takeover. He had digitized all of his lectures in that brief window after there was tech widely available and when it was safe to teach kids about history. We found some of his stuff before, and there's other materials in different locations, but his work is pretty good for this broad content and the context understanding. Oh, hey, that's our order. I'll be right back.
We see that these rights were first developed in the House of Burgesses, the Mayflower Compact, and the New England Town Meetings. Now, we've talked about the House of Burgesses already. This was of, by, and for the planter elites, and we can question how democratic it really was. It was fairly democratic for the time. The Town Meetings was more democratic, but still, women didn't have the right to vote, minorities didn't have the right to vote, and they didn't have religious toleration. The Mayflower Compact, only about half of them were Puritans, which means the other half had to be convinced or forced into accepting this idea that they all needed to work together to survive that winter. The Mayflower Compact is often seen as an early form of self-government. It is also a justification to the king for forming that self-government. Now, the colonists believed that they had the right to tax themselves. By the time of the American Revolution, all 13 colonies had some form of representative government. They all had tax rights in these colonial assemblies, and they all felt that the Parliament did not represent the colonies. This is very important when it comes to taxes. Like I said, they're British citizens. They feel loyalty to the king and the crown. but they do not feel that the Parliament has the right to violate their rights. Later, we're going to talk about no taxation without representation. They were loyal British citizens. They were expecting to have the same rights as everybody else. A lot of this comes into play with John Locke's social contract theory. Now, Locke had his theory of natural rights, that all men have the right to life, liberty, and property. A lot of the founding fathers, quote unquote, will be using John Locke as the basis of their philosophy. Now, his social contract was that the government is created by the people, and the government is given its power through the consent of the governed so that they can protect the people's natural rights. So the people give up some of their freedoms in order to protect their natural rights. And if the government stops protecting those natural rights over a long train of abuses, the government can be overthrown and replaced. So there's no state of anarchy under Locke's system. There's always some form of a government. Salutary neglect means that the colonies are going to be left alone for the good of the colonies. The British Empire was too stretched out. They could not possibly expect to directly govern the colonies. The British island was about 6 weeks away by boat, so that means that if there was an issue in the colonies, the news had to reach England 6 weeks one way, and then the king had to make a decision, which might take a few weeks or even a couple of months, and then get that message back. So it might be 6 months to a year before somebody in the colonies got any sort of direction from the king if there was some sort of an emergency. The British Empire let the colonies run themselves, essentially, for the first 100 years or so. And as long as they were following the policies of the British government, they were largely left alone. This directly ties into the American colonies feeling that they had the rights of Englishmen. The Americans were not represented in the British Parliament. Think of that as sort of the American Congress. And since they weren't represented in the British Parliament, they didn't feel that the British Parliament had the right to tax them. Also, they felt they had the right to a jury trial, which was other Americans putting them on trial and deciding cases. And there were some free speech, freedom of religion issues. The problem that helps lead to the American Revolution is when the British tried to take that power away from the colonists and put it back into British control.
So I keep mentioning the takeover, and I forget that you're a noob. We're not sure exactly when it happened, but sometime in the mid-2000s, a group known as the Armed Protectors of the Constitution, that's the political party, the APOC, became a powerful force in the U.S. They had been arguing that we needed common sense government and that we needed to bring back America. From what we've been able to uncover, the United States was ripe for this kind of nonsense. The American education system had slowly whittled away civics and history in favor of jobs training programs. What history standards were left were slowly morphed into patriotic mumbo-jumbo that made people feel good, like that Bowberry biscuit you're about to munch on, but ignore the critical thinking evidence analysis that makes a good historian. Hey, just a minute. Hey, Nina! I ordered a chicken biscuit. This is sausage?
One of the reasons why the British tried to take power back from the colonies had to do with 18th century conflicts. Essentially, throughout the 100 years of the 1700s, there were 3 long wars, the last of which was known as the French and Indian War in the United States, mainly because while it started in the Ohio River Valley, think of modern Ohio, Illinois, and such, it was a worldwide conflict between the British and the French. Now, the British eventually won this war, but like I said, it took 7 years, and it leads to a lot of tensions. While the British gained a lot of territories, they didn't want the Americans settling in the Pink area, because it would have been expensive. Why would it be expensive? Because there's a lot of Native Americans still living out there. And the Native Americans obviously don't want the Americans living in their territory, so the British were afraid that the Native Americans would try to fight the Americans, and those Americans would want defense. Defense is expensive. The British tried to keep them out of there through something called the Proclamation Line of 1763. This frustrated the Americans. They had helped fight in the French and Indian War as well. They felt as though it was their destiny to spread over the entire continent. So they felt like they were being treated almost like children, and it made them very frustrated. That war was expensive, and the British wanted the Americans to help pay some of the bills. And according to British philosophy and according to the rights of Englishmen, the Americans shouldn't have been able to have direct taxes put upon them. Now, the British needed to have somebody to help fill the treasury back up, so they did ask that the Americans pay some forms of taxes, and they argued that it was mainly for their own defense. They were okay paying their colonial assemblies taxes, but they were not okay with the British taxes. They were also not upset that the taxes were too high. British people on the island of Britain were paying about 3 times the amount of taxes. So it's not that they were high, and it's not that they were paying taxes. The British wanted them to pay taxes without representation. And it's this idea of salutary neglect being taken away. And there's all these issues of perspective. The British thought the Americans were being selfish, and they were being unthankful for the defense that they were being provided. Now, mercantilism is also at issue here. According to the idea of mercantilism, this is an economic philosophy that was in vogue at the time, and that means that hard currency, which means silver or gold, meant that a country was wealthy. And the more gold you had, the more wealth you had, the more power you had. But in order to do this, you needed to have a lot of exports, and you needed to not import a lot of things. So what the colonies were there for, according to mercantilist policy, was to provide raw materials to the mother country, in this case England. They were also there to provide markets or people to sell things to for the mother country. So companies in Britain would sell things to the Americans. They're not independent territories, so they're expected to support the mother country. This is only loosely enforced until the French and Indian War, and then afterwards the British started to crack down on things. Now, according to how mercantilism worked, the Americans could only trade with Britain. But prior to the French and Indian War, Americans were making a lot of money smuggling items to the French and in the West Indies. So by cracking down on this smuggling, the British were actually making a large number of enemies. Well, there's a few reasons why people put up with mercantilism in the first place. Prior to the French and Indian War, it really wasn't that hard to get around it. Smuggling was fairly easy. Also, it was beneficial to most Americans. If you were a lumber seller, you had a guaranteed market in England. If you were growing rice, you had a guaranteed market to sell in England. So Americans were making a lot of money off of the mercantile system. Also, they had the protection of the British Navy. So their boats that were on the ocean, they were pretty safe from pirates because the British Navy was there to protect them. That's going to change once the American Revolution is over. Now, this begins to fall apart in 1764 with the Sugar Act. This is the first time the British tried to directly tax the colonists. We call this a revenue-raising tax, where money is taken from the American pockets and put into the British treasury. Remember, prior to this, the Americans were paying taxes to their colonial assemblies, where they had voted for the representatives, so they felt that they had their rights as Englishmen. The British also cracked down on smugglers, which means that getting around the mercantile system was not as easy anymore. Now, one of the problems of this was that rather than have a jury of peers, which the British knew that other Americans would just find them innocent and let them go on their way, they tried them in admiralty courts, which is navy courts, not a jury of peers. So now you have 2 rights being violated. You have the right to being taxed only by your representatives being violated, and you have the right to a trial by jury being violated. And this led to American protests, which led to the taxes being lowered, and the colonists calmed down a bit.
Man, I hope Nina's more observant than her order-taking skills suggest. As I was saying, APOC's slogans became gospel to their followers, even though there was never this golden age to bring back. They started taking that arm part pretty seriously, and when elections started going against them, they made some veiled threats, and then some not-so-veiled threats, and then real attacks began to occur. Of course, no one could tie APOC to any of them, and in the official records, they made pretty darn sure that it was non-American terrorists that the people heard about. In the chaos, APOC offered some pretty simple solutions, and people clung to them for security, and they overlooked those pretty obvious constitutional violations. Ironic, of course, considering the Constitution is in their name. Minor infractions built on each other. Essentially, we were in a police state. APOC created the Department of Historic Memory to clean up some of those more uncomfortable elements that they were taking part in. And just a second, the guy in the corner is staring a bit too much.
A few years later, there was the Stamp Act. Again, another revenue tax. Apparently the British didn't learn their lesson. Now, the British assumed that the Americans would be okay with this because the tax was designed to go towards paying for the American military. The Americans were going to benefit from this. And it's not about how much the tax was, because the British were paying 4 times the amount of taxes in the British Islands. The problem was that there were still no representatives in Parliament, and they also increased the Admiralty courts. Again, both of these things violate the Magna Carta, and it upset the Americans about their rights. So there were 3 different reactions, and the first was probably the least effective. That was the Stamp Act Congress. All 13 colonies sent a representative to the Stamp Act Congress. They wrote a letter to the king of protest, and the king largely ignored it. Second was the non-importation agreements. These are boycotts, and they were fairly effective. About a third of the British profits were made from the Americas, so that hurt the companies, and that's what's going to help lead to the end of the Stamp Act. And lastly was the Sons of Liberty. These are violent protests. You can see in this picture right here that the Sons of Liberty did tar and feather people, and nobody wanted to be a tax collector, which meant the tax largely went away. The Stamp Act was repealed, mostly because of the boycotts. Violence was also effective, and the British were upset about this. They saw the Americans as ungrateful. They repealed the Stamp Act, which means they removed it, but Parliament did pass something called the Declaratory Acts, where they declared that they could still pass any law that they wanted, and the Americans had to follow it. And the Americans thought that their rights were being threatened, as we just talked about. This leads then to the Townshend Act in 1763. This was a random cluster of taxes on various things, the most important of which was tea. There's still no representation in Parliament, and the act was designed to pay the governors, trying to release the governors from any influence the colonists might have had on them. Smuggling increased, unrest increased, and now there's more troops in the Americas, which means that there's even more tension. We did miss the Boston Massacre in 1770. This is where troops were increased in the colonies. That led to increased tensions. It's not related to taxes. It really was a large misunderstanding. It turns into propaganda for the Americans. This is the famous Paul Revere engraving, which has little to no basis in any sort of facts. And it's oddly not the spark of the revolution. In fact, things calmed down for a few years. Until the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Now, most of you know the details of the Boston Tea Party. The key element here is that the tea was actually cheaper after the Tea Act was put in place. The colonists thought it was a trick, though. If they agreed to paying the tax on tea because it was cheaper, well, then they agreed to pay taxes in general, and the Parliament could pass any tax that it wanted. This led to the Tea Party, where the American colonists threw the tea into the lake out of protest. It was led by the Sons of Liberty. And again, let's remember that the Americans didn't want independence. They wanted to go back to that time of salutary neglect. They wanted to have the rights of Englishmen, but they wanted the British Empire to leave them alone so that they could run their countries the way, or their colonies the way they wanted. Did they want representation in Parliament? Well, they certainly cried a lot about it, but they didn't, because Americans would have been outvoted on every issue, and then they wouldn't have been able to complain that they had no representation. So they would have had the worst of both worlds. They would have had to give up their colonial assemblies, they would have been outvoted, and then they would have been stuck.
Yeah, that guy in the corner is fine. He hasn't looked over here once since you've been working. So this Powley guy, you notice resemblance? I think he's a distant relative. Anyways, APOC created the Department of Historic Memory because they knew that while history is an evidence-based debate, public memory is perhaps more important. See, the perceptions of history shape our moral compass, and if you can influence how people feel about government decisions, to shape memory is to control the people. Our mission is to re-educate the population so they can make an actual choice. Think of it this way. You've been told that Ford trucks are better than Chevys and that we're a Ford family every day of your life. What are the odds that you're going to buy a Ford? What if that Ford breaks down? Do you blame Ford? No. Do you chalk it up to driver error? Maybe. Do you think it's a conspiracy from Chevy to make you distrust your Ford? Possible. Historic memory works in a similar way. APOC has been scapegoating various groups for decades, and it manipulates the historic record back to its claims. If we can get a competing narrative out there, we have a chance to help the people start to think for themselves. Okay, I've been philosophizing long enough. Get back to work for a little bit. You want a coffee?
The Tea Party led to the Intolerable Acts. The British closed the port of Boston. All trials were sent to Britain, and there was no town meeting, so they've lost representation. They lost their trial by jury, and now their economy is even being crashed by the British as well. This led to the First Continental Congress, where the Continental Congress wrote out their complaints and sent a letter again to the king, but the king largely ignored the Congress's petition. And then rather than try to ease the tensions, they sent more troops to Boston. And this is when the Minutemen begin to openly drill in the fields. The British soldiers see them openly drilling. This makes them nervous. The Americans are nervous. And that just increases tension even further. The British had certain strengths, all of the material strengths that they wanted, but they're far away and they didn't really want to fight the Americans. And the Americans had some strengths as well leading into this conflict. It's huge. It can hit and run. Washington's a good leader, and they could possibly get aid from France. The problem with the Americans, the weakness was that they were badly organized. The states wanted all the power to themselves, and they didn't want to give any power to a central government, and they didn't really have any sort of money supply. All of this is what's leading into what's referred to as the shots heard around the world, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The tensions had been there for a long time. Essentially, the British were marching to Concord, trying to take away a weapons store from the Americans. At Lexington, on the way to Concord, they ran into some Minutemen. There was a couple of volleys lobbied back and forth. We're not sure who started it, but the shots symbolized the beginning of the American Revolution. And on the way back, they got to Concord. Nothing was there. All the supplies had been removed. On the way back, the British regulars were attacked by Americans hiding in the woods behind trees. About a third of them are going to be killed or wounded. And essentially, the Americans had started the war. As a result of this, the Second Continental Congress was created. They sent an olive branch petition in 1775. They tried to tell the king that they're loyal, they wanted peace, but again, King George ignores that letter, especially after the Battle of Bunker Hill, and declared the colonists in open rebellion, sending more army to New York City.
Hey, here's your coffee. This is a lot to take in, but it's good for you to hear, and you can ask questions when we get back to the bunker. You know President Gauss is in charge, and it looks like she was elected, but the elections are just for show. APOC basically has gangsters and enforcers filling out its governmental ranks. They make references to the Constitution and the founders, but they cherry-pick the parts they like, and they bury those that they don't. And think about it. When's the last time you saw the full Constitution? Not just the bits and pieces they put on the posters. Our local protector is Mayor Cromwell. He seems nice enough, but don't get lulled in. He's dangerous. Myrtle Beach is a prime storage location for APOC documents. It's a nice vacation spot for the officials. They want their stuff on hand. They hide the archives and data dumps around the area. You've probably been within a few dozen yards of some of the spots and not even known it. Oh no, oh, this is not good. Act casual. I think some jacks just pulled in. Keep your head down, keep working. Coming up next on the History Underground. My name's not really Zed, and Nina's shift is almost up, and we need to get her that USB back. We were histo-terrorists. I'm gonna go up and introduce myself. Hey, Mayor Cromwell. Nice to meet you. Get busy.